we're supposed to be having a discussion about where to take this new global health, this new, how to use this opportunity that we've now been given, I suppose, by COVID, what to do with it, how to take the chances that we now have to turn things around, to come up with a better version of what we currently have. As someone who has been in the field for a very long time, how do you see this?
It's interesting because I go back to 1984, which is 36 years ago. It doesn't seem it at all. And I was wanting, I was a doctor, I was 30, I wanted to work overseas. I was a pediatrician in training, I was doing neonatal brain studies, and I applied. My professor said, oh, you've got to go to the MRC unit in the Gambia, one of these kind of annexed sites that's run by the British for, tropical research. So I applied for that and I had a stiff interview and I was given the job. And I felt kind of pleased here, but not here. And the next day I got a phone call and they said, we're really sorry, but we've had to cut your job because Mrs. Thatcher has cut all the budgets for the MRC. Reapply in 18 months. And a week later, I was called to Save the Children Fund. And I'd written to them a few months earlier. And they said, would you and your wife come for an interview? And I didn't know what that was about. And they offered me a job to go and work in rural Nepal. And so we said yes. I'd never been to an interview with my wife before, And so we went to live in a rural site, 2 days walk from a road, and spent 2 years there. So it was the best education you could ever have of what rural poverty is like. And not only its weaknesses and its oppressions, but also its strengths and the beauty of its culture and just the whole history. And I mean, I fell in love with the country and I learned so much. And everyone said, well, you've fallen off the academic ladder, And when I came back, I had to struggle to get back on it. But what I was for a while, I was running a typical Save the Children Fund project. And for a while, I was the national field director. And I felt quite uncomfortable in that role, in the sense that there were people, my chief sort of program administrator was a very senior ex-civil servant, and I thought, I'm some 30-year-old doctor. And after leaving, I kind of worked out in my head that I didn't really want to go into this power imbalance. I wanted a partnership approach to research and stuff. And that's what I tried to do. And it was interesting because after I left Nepal and I thought I need to get partnerships going, it took me quite a while to find it. And then when I went to the funder, the Wellcome Trust, they said, oh, well, you have to go and live there. And I said, well, we've got an NGO that I've got a new partner and he's setting it up and I'll come and go with him. And they said, no, you've got to do it. And it brought home to me this kind of slight, well, it's a power relation thing, isn't it? And you must have experienced this yourself because the whole Black Lives Matter thing and the whole subtlety of racism, institutional racism, which is in every society. So I'd like to hear your views on that.
I think I'm fairly critical of what we do in global health, I suppose, because I think it's my field. I want it to be better because I feel very lucky to be able to work in such an important area. And that's why I'm so vocal about, the things that we need to change. And I think beyond the personal level, which is also very important when it comes to things like diversity and representation, in our institutes here in the global north. I think these things are really important, but I think also on a bigger, more macro scale is, things like the power dynamics that you talk about. The fact that we consciously or unconsciously have this impression that knowledge, true knowledge and true application of knowledge can only come from the north and be directed towards the south. And I think there are nuances to that. I think I'm in a very particular position because I'm from the global north, but I have origins in the global south. So it's very easy, it can be easy to think that just by virtue of the color of your skin or your origins, you're exempt from certain biases, you don't hold certain biases, you don't have certain ways of thinking. But I think that's not true. And I think for me, I mean, we're talking about how to make global health better. And for me, one of the things that is really important to do is to correct the power disbalances. Some of, you cited an example just now, and I think we have a big opportunity for this. So for instance, the fact that many of us haven't been able to travel. I work in an institute of tropical medicine. Obviously, our field of work is in tropical countries. The fact that many of us have not been able to travel have meant that people in those countries have been forced to, or have had the space to come up with their own solutions. So I think this is a good example of where we could work to make things better. I fear, and at the same time I hope, I try to be optimistic, that when we go back to normal, whatever that looks like, we also don't go back to the norms of capacity coming from the north and going to the south, because we have certain preconceptions about how people there are able to manage things. Also that we're much more nuanced in our thinking about things like just because someone is black or brown or whatever other culture, then they're the right person for a specific job, because surely they must be able to decolonize, or they must be. I think this is something that needs to change. Also, and I hope it will. A change. So I think these are my initial thoughts really about, and just one more thing actually, that is also very dear to me. I think when we talk about decolonization or coming up with a new improved version of global health, again, we often tend to focus abroad. Like we think of global health is in Nigeria, or global health is in, I don't know, Cambodia, but also global health is at home. Global health is global. It's supposed to be. It's the refugees or the migrants on the streets in Belgium during a pandemic, who are multiple times marginalized in ways that are so unfair, and they have completely unequal access to health services. So for me, also, there needs to be a shift in what we define as global health and how we conceptualize of that, and so that can be quite uncomfortable, because obviously it's much nicer to go work in, I don't know, Nigeria. I'm from Nigeria also, to go work in Nigeria, because all those poor people suffering over there, it's much easier to think of that than to think about children in the UK who are obese because they don't have good access to certain services. It's so much easier to focus over there. It's less uncomfortable. It also means that I don't have to question too deeply what's going on here. I can just focus somewhere else. So
I'm glad you're saying this, because having worked most of my academic career in overseas partnerships and then going to WHO and coming back to the UK and looking at the pandemic and the kind of mess that we've got into, because we are among the worst nations in the world at dealing with this. And it throws up all kinds of questions about the degradation of public health, about the hierarchies in our system, and about our inability now to mobilize communities and to think about the social determinants of health. Everything is technical. It's about an immune passport or a lateral flow test or a new vaccine, rather than the basics of public health. And many countries that have much tinier budgets have done far better, far better. In East Asia, in Africa, you know, Senegal has done very well. Actually, most of the African states are doing okay. I mean, they may get an echo and a bounce later on, but so that raises that. I mean, a few things is in the power relations. I mean, every country I've had experience of and read a lot about has its own power hierarchies. So in Nepal and India, it's caste. And it's that's a very fixed, almost hereditary view of people. In Britain, as you well know, there's a class system, and it's very effective. And at the moment, I find it really depressing that, in a sense, the class system is worse now almost than when I was starting out 30, 40 years ago, you know, that everyone across the media, in professional groups, in politics, a lot of people, it's unspoken, but it's there. Yeah. And, you know, people are from public schools, from certain background, the way you talk and all the rest of it. And then, of course, you've got, in Africa, you've got tribal affiliations. So if you're in Kenya, Kikuyus do better than anyone else. In, you know, the Tutsis or the Tigrayans in Ethiopia. And, you know, I won't speculate on Nigerian, but there are elites in every country. Now, you face the double whammy, because in addition, there is this whole complexity of color of skin, the colonial hangover, and particularly the hangover of slavery. Yeah. And what I find so interesting, because when I started off, I was pretty naive. I was a doctor and I wanted to go off, and everyone talked about tropical medicine. And when global health came in, which is only about 10 years ago, no, 15 years ago, I liked that term, because we knew that there were more poor people living in rich countries than in poor countries. I mean, in terms of the numbers, because poverty is a huge issue in Britain, as we're seeing. There's hunger in Britain. There are food banks in Britain. There is, and I go up north a lot because my wife's from Yorkshire, and the poverty there is quite shocking, actually. In some ways, it's worse than the rural poverty I got used to in Nepal, because people have lost hope, you know, and they don't have a sense of ownership and things. So this is all very complex, and we could talk about, actually, I wish this was about 2 hours, this discussion. But it's how you start to tackle it. And one thing I would say, and then I'll throw it back to you, a pediatrician who trained me a long time ago said, he was talking about adolescents, and he said, you can't give them their freedom, they have to take it. Okay. And what I have seen, there are some ways in which the situation has improved a lot, that there's a whole generation now of very dynamic people from Africa, from Asia, from China, from all over, who are thirsty for education, for knowledge, for change. And my only advice is, you have to, if you want to change institutional racism, you have to change the way institutions are run. And to do that, you don't wait to be asked. You have to claim your position. And that means being a little bit, you know, strident, in the same way that the women's suffragettes 100 years ago were laughed at and derided and considered strident, but they demanded what they eventually got. So I'm just wondering, from your perspective, do you see a hope in being able to elbow your way up and not just be put down in your place? Or do you still see it as an insurmountable burden?
So I'm now training to be a political scientist in my free time, and to be a social scientist. So I'm learning the jargons from those areas as well. And I think for me, this goes back to the balance between structure and agency. Um, People maybe want to, but the structures that are in place, these are not things that came into place last year or 5 years or 10 years ago. These are existing structures that, yeah, just for instance, the idea that if you want to study, if you want to learn about sleeping sickness, if you want to learn about some tropical disease, you have to go abroad to the global north to learn about this. That naturally, what's the word, excludes lots of people. If you are a scientist, no matter how extremely determined you are, and you're studying in, I don't know, the Gambia, but your knowledge never gets up to the rest of the world because you have to publish in a journal that costs perhaps as much as a month's salary. It just doesn't make. So I think sitting here, I recognize my privilege. I recognize the privilege of my passport. That's why I'm able to just go off and live in Belgium just because I feel like it. I recognize the privilege of the fact that I'm educated, that I have certain. So in some ways it's easier to be vocal. It's easier to be more to be pushy when you have certain things behind you. But and this is again talking about scientists from the global south, but it's also talking about people here. For me, it's really important that when we talk about decolonization, it's not just over there, it also needs to happen here at home. And for me, one of the key attributes of decolonization, or one of the key attributes of colonization, or that concept, is capitalism, and the way that everything has to have an economic value, even knowledge, even. And so decolonizing also then means that we have to, which is obviously a very big ask indeed, in our current world, but we have to shift away from our current model, which is perhaps, some might say, beyond the reach of what we can do in global health. So maybe we cannot change the economic system as a whole, but maybe we can contribute to, in some ways, dismantling wherever we can. So for instance, maybe when it comes to things like journal publication fees, making it more accessible for people from the global south, but also from people from here in the global north, the topics that are being studied, the knowledge that is classified as important. So I think I've kind of gone all over the place, but the point I wanted to make is it's not just in response to the question you posed. It's not just about people taking their chance and elbowing their way to the front.
Mm.
Sometimes the structure is just so difficult to break down. No matter how optimistic or determined you are, sometimes it's just really difficult to get there, especially when you think about the fact that people have to eat. And given the current structures that we have, sometimes people are pragmatic and they just think, I'm just going to do whatever I need to do so I can feed my family, which is, yeah. So.
Gosh, you touch on a lot of issues. And of course, I was brought up in a time before we've had 40 years of neoliberalism. I mean, in the post-war era, there was a much more expansive view of optimism and of investment in people and in state structures. People believed that government was essentially good and important, and there was a much more social democratic ethos. And that was thrown out of the window, really, by the arrival of people like Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, and subsequent economists, and we're still in that neoliberal era, although we're seeing the kind of financial crises, the climate crisis, now the pandemic crisis. And interestingly, the most Anglo-Saxon individualist neoliberal economies are the ones that have suffered most in the pandemic, because they're not equipped to dealing with many things. And I'm going to be fascinated to see how this reverberates around, for example, the Wellcome Trust. I mean, I don't want to pick on them particularly, because they've actually been quite progressive and they've tried to fund capacity building in Africa and invest in different ways. But looking at, the way, if we take health research, vast amount of money goes on bioscience, not on public health. A recent survey from Nesta showed that I think 94% goes on bioscience and drugs, and 2% goes on public health. So there's this imbalance of power between the labs and the field. And even if it's in the field, it tends to be testing drugs and vaccines rather than thinking about the social dimensions of health. But I think the issue of decolonialization, to come back to the point, firstly, I think we could do a lot in our curricula. Yeah. If you look at British society and education, we simply do not talk about colonialism. I mean, the Germans have to face up to the reality of Nazism and the Holocaust, and that must be incredibly uncomfortable for them. The Russians, well, they don't really, but they have to face up to the reality of Stalinism that killed 25 million. The Chinese have to, but they don't necessarily face up to the reality of Maoism, which in its early days was a freedom fighting movement, but then became a disastrous, caused a famine killing 50 million people. But British colonialism led to tens of millions of deaths and economic destruction, actually. I mean, or rather looting and pillage, and lasting geopolitical and cultural degradation that we still have with us today. I mean, the whole Middle East was drawn by a civil servant's pen. The partition of India, which was a disaster in many ways, caused millions of deaths. The Bengal famine, all the famines throughout the 19th century, all kinds of things that people don't read about and aren't taught. We hear about, nice stories of the Raj and films about the empire as though it was some, it's still a very racist kind of construct. And I think we need to teach that. I think we need to have much more critical exploration of what colonialism was about and how voices were suppressed and incipient governance was destroyed. And we're still dealing with that now. I mean, you've got Nigerian heritage, and so, it's very interesting when you compare Nigerians with, say, Caribbeans, because the Caribbeans have this awful heritage of slavery, which you avoided. And it's interesting to me that in Nigeria, you have a very defined culture, you have very strong family structures, you have, I'm sure you're critical of Nigerian corruption or politics or whatever, but there's a very definite sense of Nigerianness and culture and behavior and passion about education. I mean, Nigerians are the best educated part of the UK, actually. But, in Caribbean, they're living, and in Southern America, or all of America, the Black population are living with this horrendous history that destroyed their culture, that broke up families. My first job as a medical student was I went to St. Lucia for an elective. And I only discovered then that within my grandparents' lifetime, people had not been allowed to get married. And that had gone on for a century. So then people wondered why there were high rates of single mothers coming over to the UK, and that there wasn't, people didn't get married, and there were, lost generation of men who, and all of this stuff. And it was a direct consequence, of colonialism. And we don't talk about that. So I think that's something that I've, hoping that I'll be involved in designing a curriculum for something like a master's in decolonializing global health or whatever. I mean, I think it would be fascinating to do that and face up to it. I'll stop talking. I'm doing too
No,
much.
I was just going to jump on what you said about having a master's in decolonizing global health, and I think that's really important. But because now I live in Belgium, so I'm looking at it from a very global perspective, I guess. I think one way or two ways I'm going to kind of feed off of some of the things you said. So I think one way to really help to build a better kind of global health is looking at our past in global health. And so, for instance, you were talking about how we don't talk about, specifically in the UK, we don't talk about the things that happened during colonization, and we don't really address this, but it's the same thing, exactly the same thing that happens in global health. We kind of hide the things in the past and just assume that since the intention is good, then it's okay. But that's really not the case. I think unless we address the history of the field, it came from tropical medicine, which itself came from colonial medicine. Unless we address all of that, we're just going to be building on a rotten foundation somehow. So I think I very much agree with what you're saying about digging into the past, and just I think it also helps to recognize some of the failings and the not so great legacies of this era that still linger today. So I think that
more than lingers. I mean, 20 years ago, I wrote an article with Ali Zumra, who's a professor at UCL, who's from Zambia actually, and it was about moving towards research partnerships in low-income countries. And we talked about the problems of semi-colonial annexed sites run by Brits, postal research where you send, specimens, or parachute research where researchers go in and then take specimens out, and all of this, and how it was wrong, and how it was, and also that these sites were often doing donor robbery. So I saw this a lot in Malawi, that sites that came in and removed talented locals into research sites were denuding the national institutions. And we came up with the ideas about how to do partnership models. And I've always tried to do that. I've had 5 partnerships around the world in Nepal, Bangladesh, India, and Malawi. And they all were based on having local institutions. I didn't want to work through British-run institutions, and forming partnerships where the rules were that you did actually share, you had to discuss things and negotiate issues. We actually came up in that paper, I was just dug it out before today, about, the semi-colonial model is where the research agenda is dominated by the outsiders rather than negotiated, where links with national institutions are peripheral rather than integral. And I think that's very important. And, line management by foreigner, we abolished all of that. Now, I said to any research fellows that went, you're line managed locally. You can come to me about supervision, but ultimately we're supporting that structure. So, there are things that you can do, and getting research into policy and practice, I think it's much more valuable doing it that way, because all my partners were very able to have a voice locally, and having that voice to influence policymakers and the like. And also I loved it because they all became my friends, and I learned so much about the local culture. And that's what makes global health so exciting, because you discover the, anthropology and the history and the politics. And And so I've enjoyed that, but I still come back. In a sense, I'm sad we're having this conversation, because actually there's still that problem. And I was horrified, I better not mention where, but there was a paper with about 30 authors on about the implications for COVID in low-income settings, published by a university in the UK. And there was not a single person from a low-income country on it. And I thought, what world do people live in that think they can do that? So you're up against it. You've got a whole career ahead of you. You'll still be fighting these battles when you're my age, but life's like that. You know, I see big changes. I mean, I'm optimistic about Africa. I'm optimistic about the countries I've worked in. I'm less optimistic about Britain, actually, in some ways. I think we've got to reform ourselves, and in all kinds of ways, but the struggle never ceases.
I'm also quite optimistic. I think I think we talked about quite a few things. I think this conversation could go on for 4 hours, and we would still not be able to cover everything. But I think we, you know, still pointed out a few key things, you know, and I'm optimistic. Why? Because there is, I mean, I was a nurse for many years before I became a public health kind of researcher. But when I first joined, came into public health, I didn't have this impression that there was a critical approach to what was happening in the field. Now, in the last, I don't know, particularly in the last 2-3 years, there seems to be this current of critical, not criticism, but a critical eye to what we do and how we can make it better. And of course, this has many different perspectives, but specifically when it comes to things like decolonizing, it's you know, people thinking of how we can do this and how we can make things better. I feel optimistic because we're talking about it, and okay, the fight, a luta continua, as they say, another 100 years, but there's progress, and we're moving in the right direction.